Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into the history of Lithuania. It's a country with this really incredible, quite complex journey, mixing those ancient origins with its place in modern Europe. And just to be clear, we're basing this whole deep dive completely on the materials you sent us, that whole stack of articles and research, everything from a brief history of Lithuania to, well, really specific texts on different times and cultural bits.
Exactly. And our mission here really is to go through all that material you provided together.
Yeah.
We want to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and help you get a really solid understanding of Lithuania's journey from those early days right up to the modern European state it is now. We're looking for those turning points, the challenges, definitely the challenges, and the resilience that just comes through so clearly in the history, all based on the sources you shared.
Yeah, think of it as a kind of focused shortcut. You get to be really well informed on this fascinating history, and we're zeroing in on what's, well, most impactful and honestly just really interesting stuff from your research. Okay, so let's unpack this then. The material you've shared, it takes us way, way back, starts right in the Neolithic period. It notes Lithuania as one of the earliest inhabited spots in Europe, settled by these ancient Baltic tribes.
That's right. And the sources show that, by the 10th century, this area was already starting to come together, even paying tribute to Kievan Rus. Figures like Kniaz Sviatoslav are mentioned. What's really fascinating, though, is seeing how quickly it evolved from those early tribal setups.
And here's where, for me, it gets really interesting. Your sources talk about the Grand Duchy of Lithuania forming late 13th century under Mindaugas. And it didn't just form, did it? It, exploded in size.
Oh, absolutely. By the 14th century, the GDL, the Grand Duchy, was a Meiji power. And by the 15th century, that was its peak. The sources you gave us, they really emphasize the sheer scale. I mean, huge. Stretching from the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea.
Wow.
We're talking modern Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, parts of Poland. It was, for a time, the largest state in Europe. Late Middle Ages.
The largest state in Europe. That's incredible. And that size, it wasn't just about being big, right? It put it in this critical strategic position, a major crossroads for trade, for culture, linking east and west, north and south.
Exactly. But, that strategic spot also meant constant pressure. The sources are very clear. Swedes, Russians, Poles, and especially the Teutonic Knights, they were always rivals, always threats, fighting over these lands. In fact, the confrontation with the Crusaders is highlighted as a key reason the GDL even formed and consolidated in the first place.
Your materials also dig into a huge shift adopting Christianity. And it happened quite late, didn't it, compared to other parts of Europe, 1387.
Yes, very late. And the sources, they frame this as a really deliberate strategic choice. Converting specifically to Roman Catholicism in 1387, it was seen as vital. Vital for statehood, for foreign relations, for basically plugging Lithuania into that whole Western European system.
Right.
It marked the official end of paganism, its founding as a European Christian state.
But even after that, religion didn't just settle down. It stayed a source of tension. Your sources bring up the Union of Brest, 1595. They talk about power struggles between Catholic and Orthodox churches, even a decades-long war over church music and rites. Crazy.
Yeah, it really brings up a fundamental question about the GDL, doesn't it? How did they manage such a massive, diverse state, all these different languages, faiths, customs? And the sources acknowledge it was tough. They mentioned that while cultures coexisted, real contact, meaningful contact, was often limited to the very top levels, social and political spheres, at least at first.
And just jumping back to the very start for a sec, the sources also mention those prehistoric settlements, dwelling mounds, especially around future Vilnius, where East Baltic tribes settled by the rivers, the Vilnia, and Neris, kind of setting the stage for everything that came later, including trade. So this huge Grand Duchy forms, built on these ancient tribes, strategic rivers. The geography itself, described in your sources, was really varied. Major rivers, mountains mentioned, huge swampy areas.
Definitely not a uniform landscape. And the sources, they list all the different regions within it, like Memeland, Polosk, Vilna, Samagisha, Kauno, a real mosaic. And they point out it wasn't just ethnic Lithuanians. Lots of different cultures thrived there, like the Vilnian Hebrews, the term your sources use, likely referring to the Jewish communities who played a big role in the city's spiritual and cultural life.
Right.
Especially in Vilnius, their presence was really significant.
Right, and we see this expansion under leaders like Duke Gediminas. And with Catholicism coming in, your sources note this application of, Christian civilization principles.
Exactly. And politically, Poland emerges as a key ally pretty quickly. Vilnius becomes the capital, grows into the second largest city in Eastern Europe, and stayed the capital, according to your sources, for an amazing 500 years.
5 centuries. Wow, that really speaks to its importance, doesn't it? And your sources really stress that Vilnius wasn't just political, it was a cultural powerhouse.
Absolutely. A huge boost came from Vilnius University, founded in 1579. It was shaped by Renaissance humanism, became this major center of learning, not just for Lithuania, but influential in parts of modern Poland and Belarus, too.
The sources also really praise the Baroque architecture in Vilnius. They call the late 17th century its Gold Age, inspired by Rome, but with this unique local twist described as extremely free.
And culturally, the sources highlight a flourishing of church music during that Baroque era. They mention polyphonic masses, name specific composers like Kozlowski and Gombrowski, and even single out works like the Concapitulum as being historically and artistically important, even on a European scale.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? Vilnius is this dynamic, layered city, tolerance, civic freedoms. But as the sources remind us, always subject to the whims, the instability of the momentary policy of the Grand Duke. Okay, so this history with Poland, it takes a really pivotal turn. Your sources say a dynastic union started early, 1387, same family ruling both.
Right, and that eventually leads to the Union of Lublin in 1569. That's what formally creates the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, which, as you said, the sources call one of Europe's largest states.
So unity, shared power, but also challenges baked right in, according to your sources. They talk about the blessings of the Renaissance, but also the burdens of a politically mixed social structure. These differences in language, religion, culture, clashes were almost inevitable. Friction.
Precisely. The sources even detail the mix in Vilnius itself. You had Poles and then Litvins, that term they use for groups like Russians, Jews, Tatars, and religious divisions too, especially among nobles. Polish nobles mostly Catholic, while Litvan nobles could be a Uniate, that's Eastern Catholic Orthodox, or Jewish. Uniatism was that effort to bring Orthodox churches under the Pope, letting them keep their rights.
And the sources point out something interesting. Polish kings of Polish background were often adverse to any Litvan of their dynasty succeeding in the Grand Duchy. That must have added another layer of political tension.
For sure. And this union, it really ramps up Polish cultural influence, particularly after Lublin. Polish music spreads, and Polish becomes the only language used in Lithuanian church services by the early 17th century. The sources really frame the church as a key driver in, well, Polonizing Lithuania.
But the sources also stress, even with all that influence, Vilnius kept its multi-ethnic feel. Catholic and Orthodox churches still operated. Right up to World War I, it was this vital hub for Slavic culture, especially Polish and Jewish culture. And then, of course, it became the center of the Lithuanian state again in the interwar years.
It just underlines how layered Vilnius's identity always was. Your sources even mention how way back when Gediminas invited German and Jewish traders in 1323, people were sometimes just called Vilnians, defined by the place itself, this blend.
This shared history, though, leads into a really tough period, the partitions. Your sources mark the first one, partitioning the Commonwealth, in 1772.
Yeah, carved up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Your sources use stark language. They call it the first legal international act of dismembering Lithuania.
And the material you provided says Lithuania really bore the brunt of that first one, losing almost half its territory. And despite trying to reform, like with the 1791 Constitution from the Great Seer, the Commonwealth just collapsed by mid-1795 after the second and third partitions.
And under continuous Russian rule, Lithuania completely lost its independence. Your sources describe it as a time of anguish, this gradual imposition of Russian ways, Russian institutions.
And that meant serious cultural suppression. Your sources listed out, Vilnius declared a Russian fortress, universities shut down, nobles deported, exiled to Siberia and elsewhere, estates confiscated, even attempts in the 1820s, Romantic era stuff, trying to revive Vilnius with Polish nationalism, just crushed.
Russian policy was pretty blunt about its goal: annihilate the Polish language. They saw it as carrying Polish tradition, culture, potential statehood. So Polish schools closed, Polish books banned.
There's a powerful quote in your sources from that time capturing the mood. If not God, then Swede. If not Swede, then Moscow. Basically anyone but the Russians.
Yeah, it was a period of real cultural darkness in Vilnius, as your source puts it. Catholic churches restricted, buildings closed or turned into Orthodox churches. The Vilnius diocese put under the Moscow Patriarchate. They even tried imposing Grozdanka, a Cyrillic alphabet, which the sources say was wholly unadaptable for Lithuanian. Just didn't work.
But oppression like that, it often backfires,
Yeah.
right? Strengthens identity. And your sources definitely talk about a national awakening.
Exactly. The sources point to this resurgence of national feeling, sparked partly by the 1848 revolutions elsewhere in Europe, and really gaining steam by the Great Seimas of Vilnius in 1905. That assembly made 10 demands, crucially including restoring the right to publish in Lithuanian, teach Lithuanian in schools.
The early 20th century is really framed as the core of this awakening, kept alive by underground religious texts, constant efforts to get around the ban on printing Lithuanian in Latin letters.
Interestingly, the sources mention that even the Tsarist government started looking a bit more positively on this Lithuanian movement by the 1850s, maybe saw it as a sort of defense of national identity, politically useful somehow. This is when you see key figures like the writer Moroni's emerge.
Then comes the catastrophe of World War I. Your sources really lay the blame, calling it a conspiracy between two dictatorships, the German Hitler and the Soviet Stalin, setting the stage for what followed.
Yeah, the whole WWI period was just devastating. Your sources detail the occupations one after another. Soviet in 1940, Nazi from mid-41, then Soviet again in 44. And each one brought, as your source says, mass terror, deportations, huge loss of life.
The sources give these awful details about the Soviet deportations, like June 14, 1941, packing families, even babies, into cattle cars, shipping them off to Siberia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
Just horrific.
And the Nazi occupation. Some might have initially hoped it was a lesser evil, but your sources say it quickly became clear it was the same terror, extermination camps, mass graves, that chilling image they describe of people just standing in ditches waiting.
Yet somehow, out of all that darkness, the push for independence strengthened. Your sources note that, trying to avoid being annexed, Lithuanians declared independence from Russia on February 16, 1918, even with the German military administration sort of temporarily okaying it.
February 16th, 1918. Your sources call that date lastingly important, even tattooed to the skin of elder Lithuanians. It was this moment of naive but vital belief in independence. The declaration happened, recognition followed surprisingly fast, and Lithuania got into the League of Nations.
So 1918, a crucial step. But the interwar years weren't exactly peaceful. Your sources describe these wars of independence, Lithuania fighting Germans, Poles, Red Armies, just to hold on to its territory.
And a huge point of conflict was Vilnius. Your sources state the first peace treaty of 1920 actually gave Vilnius and its region to Poland, which ignited this whole massive, long-lasting issue, the Vilnius question. Lithuanians felt it was theirs and fought for it.
The material also mentions the difficulty of making Vilnius seem like a viable capital again during that time, given all the linguistic and political issues swirling around it.
Right, and your sources also note that during this interwar period, Vilnius became known as the Second Jerusalem, really highlighting its incredibly important Jewish community, whose tragic decline, the sources note, started when Polish and Lithuanian forces entered the city.
Now, shifting focus slightly, your sources also touch on the economy later, post-Soviet times. They talk about rapid growth, 92 to 2007, moving from that planned socialist system to a market economy. But it was painful, right? Limiting consumption, price hikes, high unemployment at first.
Yes, and they mention this thing called alternative trading. Sounds like a process where private savings were used by companies to buy up property, apartments, land. The sources suggest this boosted GDP, but maybe didn't immediately help average people's income, before a second growth spurt happened after the 2007-2009 crisis.
Okay, circling back to World War II then, your sources detail the Soviet occupation in 1940, fallout from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They describe the ultimatum, the tanks rolling in, and then this swift, brutal Sovietization. Purges, repressions, deportations, starting almost immediately, just a month in.
And then the Nazi occupation kicking off June 22, 1941. Your sources note thousands fled Vilnius Soviets, Jews as the Red Army pulled back. German troops took the city just days later, June 25th. And what followed, the sources call a general plan for Lithuania, a project for the total destruction of the Lithuanian people, starting with mass executions of Jews right there in Vilnius, early July 41.
The Soviet return in summer 44 is described really starkly in your sources, a retroversion by an onrushing superpower, just reimposing a totalitarian system that Lithuanians were, frankly, ill-prepared for. By 1944, the sources estimate nearly a third of the population was dead. Devastating losses, especially for Jewish and Polish communities.
And that post-war Soviet era meant Lithuania was stuck inside the USSR for 50 years. 50 years. Lost that independence they'd fought for.
But resistance didn't just vanish. Your sources talk about armed resistance, the partisan or forest war. Started partly in Gulag camps, continued across the Baltics. In Lithuania, it was active until the mid-1960s. Involved maybe 200,000 people, according to some estimates in your material. Huge numbers.
And information about that whole struggle. It was deliberately buried by the Soviets for decades, only really started coming out globally much later, partly through books like The Great Forest, published in '81 by Petras Paprika, a Lithuanian political prisoner.
Your sources also point out how that cultural suppression just kept going through the 19th and 20th centuries under Russian rule, closing universities, banning alphabets. And they note historical writing often sidelined culture created in languages other than Lithuanian right up until the Soviet Union ended in 1990.
Which is why regaining independence was so crucial, not just politically, but for understanding their own history. From 1990 onwards, Lithuanian researchers could finally get into those closed archives, allowing proper research into all this, including like the rich but often ignored history of confessional music.
Which brings us to the restoration of independence, March 11, 1990. After 50 years. Your sources credit those changes within the USSR itself, glasnost, perestroika under Gorbachev, for empowering movements like Sudis to really push for change.
And the church, it found a new public voice, started openly challenging the regime, promoting Lithuanian identity. Your sources describe this incredible mass activism across the country, leading to things like the Revolution of the Baltic Way, that amazing human chain across all 3 Baltic states, and the whole wider movement, the Singing Revolution.
International recognition for the restored state came next, though your sources mention some early diplomatic bumps, especially around that persistent Vilnius question. But they also note successful diplomacy led to treaties, neighbors recognizing Vilnius as the capital, even before full international recognition was locked in.
Your sources bring us pretty much up to modern Lithuania, reestablish independence, but they point out those historical echoes, like the Vilnius issue, the fight for territory. They still resonate, still represent challenges.
And economically, as we touched on, that post-Soviet transition was rough at first. Ignorance and poverty, the sources say. But they state the country transformed fast, came out strong within about a decade, achieved growth, modernized infrastructure, joined the global economy, got a positive trade balance with neighbors and the EU by the early 2000s.
Culturally, the sources dig deeper into those ideas of national awakening and cultural revival. They make a distinction between peaceful revival and violent uprising, describing the time before the 1860s uprisings as a kind of cultural hibernation. But, and this is key, they emphasize that hopes for revival, for restoring independence, they never died. They were kept alive quietly in the souls of people.
And Vilnius today, still a cultural hub, known for arts influenced by those old Polish and Byzantine connections, universities, theaters, its historic center as a World Heritage Site. Your sources mention contemporary stuff too, composers, street art festivals, alternative art scenes.
A really defining moment for modern Lithuania, though, was joining the EU, May 1st, 2004. Your sources call it a truly historic moment, the result of over a decade of focused work. And they note Lithuania passed all the tough tests for membership.
The sources mention the positives, like hosting EU meetings successfully, but also some newer tensions, like these urban-rural conflicts over river activities, a modern issue reflecting old geographic ties.
And it's really significant, as your sources highlight, that Lithuania joined both the EU and NATO. They call Lithuania the first ex-Soviet Union state to consistently adhere to integration into the structures of Western powers.
Right.
This was apparently a top priority right from the start, even when facing doubts, like that French president's comment about Baltic NATO membership being a red line.
Finally, your sources look ahead. Current challenges, ongoing geopolitical stuff tied to unresolved history with neighbors, and the difficulties facing historians themselves, especially with multinational layers and finding sources for niche things like that confessional music.
They also flag demographic shifts, an aging society, migration's impact, and the ongoing work of strengthening democracy, civic engagement, rebuilding social connections after decades of foreign domination, plus aspirations for more modernization.
The sources really drive home how complex studying Lithuanian history is, precisely because of all those overlapping nationalities and the, well, subjective feelings that create, especially looking at it through a purely national lens versus a multicultural one.
Yeah, and they end with this quite evocative image of Vilnius, the city of the second sign of Europe, a place where East and West literally met through Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic faiths coexisting alongside multiple nationalities, shaping its unique character, a city of churches, distinct architecture. So if we pull all this together, everything from the history you provided, What really stands out is this arc. A state that rose to great power then endured centuries of foreign rule, immense suffering, especially in the 20th century, but showed this incredible, consistent resilience, leading to national awakenings, this powerful drive for independence, and ultimately successfully joining Western structures like the EU and NATO.
Yeah, it's a history shaped by borders always shifting, by geopolitics constantly pressing in, and the amazing endurance of culture and identity against really overwhelming odds. And Vilnius itself feels like such a symbol of that whole story. A crossroads city, sometimes blending things beautifully, sometimes tragically clashing.
This deep dive really shows those deep links between land, power, culture, survival. And it's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that history is rarely simple. It's layered, complex, and its important narratives, especially the multinational ones, are always being re-examined, re-understood, just like your sources suggest with the current research challenges.
Well, thanks for letting us take this deep dive into Lithuania's history with you using your really fascinating sources. It's been quite something.
It really has. And thinking about those periods, the cultural suppression, then the national awakening we explored, it kind of leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on. In today's world, so interconnected, so globalized, how do unique cultures and national identities actually sustain themselves? And what battles, as your sources kind of hint, do they still have to fight just to keep people culture out of memory? Something to think about.